Good evening, WNBA and LA Sparks fans, and welcome in to the LA Sparks 365 Network, your 24/7, 365 comprehensive home of the WNBA and your two-time WNBA champion, Los Angeles Sparks. And welcome in, folks, to tonight's WNBA recap show for Thursday night, October the 2nd, 2014. Recapping the 2014 season for the Indiana Fever, alongside Chris and Mancy from a pretty depressed Annenhart Studios in Anaheim, California. Cal McClure joining you folks here from another scorching hot Studio 171 in San Diego. Chris, the roof caved in up at studios tonight, Chris, because of the Angel loss tonight. Other than that, how's the day been, dude?
That loss is done.
Now, folks, before we get to the recap tonight, I have to pass along some quick breaking news from the Fever. As a matter of fact, as we get ready to talk about the Fever tonight, folks, reports are in from SwishAppeal.com that star forward Tamika Catchings, folks, announced today, but she will be retiring after the 2016 season because of her age. We will talk more about that later on the program. Now, folks, another quick alert for you folks, or another update for you folks real quick, is today I was checking my email today, and I did get a reply message back from a certain player today, folks. Now, if you guys know, I did interview Candace Parker last week for a broadcasting school assignment, folks. Well, two birds with one stone, folks. Coming up in a few weeks, I'm supposed to be conducting another interview with Sparks guard Candace Wiggins coming up in the coming few weeks. Trying to work out that time and date, but we will let you folks know right now that that's going to be happening sometime very soon. All right, Chris, to the task at hand, man. The sixth recap of the night, or the week, I should say, Chris. The Indiana Fever, Chris, coming off of a second-place finish in the WNBA's Eastern Conference, finishing 16-18, Chris. And, of course, man, the obvious first talking point of the season, Chris, of course, is the final season, Chris, of a tremendous coach, leader, sort of that grandma, mother figure, Chris. The final year, Chris, that we got to see Lynn Dunn coach, Chris, after she spent almost 42 years of her life coaching women's basketball, Chris, and she sort of has seen the rise and decline of women's basketball from the start of the old ABL in 96 to the early years of the WNBA to the high of the league to the very low point, Chris. She has sort of seen it all, man, and I think that her resume, Chris, speaks volumes of how well she performed in the league, and a coach that a lot of players have loved playing for because of her personality and her grit and determination, Chris. And I think, man, that the Fever, as we said a lot during the playoffs, man, they had a lot to play for because of Lynn Dunn's final season, man. And Chris, it's one deal to see like Derek Jeter or Tony Gwynn play 20 years with the team, Chris. But how about a coach, Chris, who devoted over 40 years of her life to coaching basketball at any level she could, man? I think that pretty much speaks volumes, Chris, of how much Lynn Dunn has been loved for by everybody across the league, man, for her effort, Chris. How do you think, man, or actually I should ask you, how will you remember Lynn Dunn for her tremendous 40-year career across all platforms of women's basketball, man?
Just a great career by Lynn Dunn.
Chris, I know it's one deal, man, that we see players that will play their whole career with one team, Chris, but I think it's more so, man, when you see someone other than a player, Chris, that spends more than 10 years, but spends more than 10 years with one team, Chris, and Lynn Dunn is that suitor, Chris. She's done so much great work with the WNBA, and also, Chris, the laundry list of people, of coaches, man, that have come from the Lynn Dunn coaching tree, basically, man, has been unheard of. How she's had at least 8 or 10 different coaches go pro or coach college, man. That speaks volumes, Chris, of how much love and respect that the women's basketball game has for Lynn Dunn. Now, Chris, the transition year, Chris, goes from Lynn Dunn to her associate head coach last year, Stephanie White, Chris. Now, Stephanie White coached the team, basically, Chris. Now, basically, man, this was sort of like her internship almost. Lynn Dunn was still on the sidelines, Chris, but wasn't talking during timeouts. Really wasn't expressing herself, Chris. She was more so letting her sidekick get all the reputation, and basically, Chris. Now going forward, man, next season a new coach after what's been a great run with Lynn Dunn, Chris. Do you think, though, man, it'll take some time for the Fever to sort of get used to having Stephanie White in their ear all the time and not having Lynn Dunn and that Southern accent, Chris, getting in their behinds, Chris? So I guess I'll say, man, we know it'll be a transition year, Chris. What do you think, though, comes out of it, though? Again, man, knowing there is going to be a changing of the guard, though, on the bench in Indiana.
I think to be seen different, not seeing been done on the bench.
I think everybody agrees as far as that goes. Now, Chris, again, you know, the Fever have not been one, Chris, to overturn head coaches like we've seen with a few other clubs, Chris. But again, man, this is going to be Chris, this won't be a rebuilding year for the Fever. It'll be sort of that transition year, basically, like it was with the Sparks issue with the ownership group, Chris. This is just a on-court change where it's just going to be a new head coach. Now, Chris, back to the top of the show, breaking news, Chris, again, that I did get reports today from Switchbill.com, Chris. They did report that Tamika Catchings announced today on local Indianapolis TV that she has decided, Chris, to retire following the 2016 WNBA season and possibly the 2016 Olympic Games. And, Chris, it's been sort of a long time coming for Catch, Chris. It's been, you know, a very, very decorated career for Tamika Catchings, Chris, between winning her first title in 2012, 2 years ago, Chris. I mean, it took her a long time, man, but she has been the face of the franchise. She basically, Chris, is to the Fever as what Paul George is to the Pacers, and she is the face of the franchise, man. She's been there for this franchise since the early get-go of the team, has been there for the past 10 years, man, or 12 years, I should say, Chris, and had a very, very successful college career. Chris was a part of the team that went unbeaten at Tennessee in '97 between her and Shamika Holsclaw and a few other players, Chris. And now, man, that we're seeing another WNBA legend and cornerstone retiring sometime soon, Chris. Okay, man, it was a long time coming for Catch, man. You know, it took her basically towards, you know, her 8th, 9th season to win that long-lost title, Chris. When her career does end in 2 years, man, how will you remember Tamika Catchings, Chris, for her career? I'm going to remember it, Chris, for her all-around play in the league, but also, Chris, how much of an ambassador she is for the community, for the WNBA Cares Foundations, Chris. And, Chris, a lot of people forget, man, that Tamika does battle being deaf. I mean, she does have a hearing impairment, Chris, and she still has gone out there and played her best, Chris. How will you, man, mostly remember Tamika Catchings for her career on the court, as well as being a great ambassador for the league off the floor as well?
Just a great basketball player all around, and great off the court also.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, I don't think I've seen one player that is so involved in the WNBA, that is so involved in, you know, off the court things, Chris. I mean, Tamika's done so much tremendous work, Chris, for the WNBA Cares Foundation. She's got her own foundation, Chris, called the Catch the Stars Foundation, Chris, which helps young kids that do have hearing impairments, Chris. And I mean, you know, she is, I mean, you know, Chris, she basically is what she is to the Fever. As I said, she's what she is to the Fever, what Paul George is to the Pacers, and that is being the face of the franchise. Now, Chris, one thing I want to get to on the floor here with the Fever, Chris, is something that I think, Chris, sort of plagued them towards the end of the year, Chris, which would be their team chemistry. Chris, I think that this year some things didn't really click this season because they had a few new faces come in, like Lashia Clarendon and Marissa Coleman came in this year, Chris. And I think, man, that the Fever, as we saw, Chris, during a few games against LA, both times against the Sparks, a few times in the postseason, Chris, especially Game 3 and Game 2, where they blew those leads incrementally in those contests. Chris, I think, man, that sort of, I think, was a bit of a blow, Chris, to their team chemistry, I think, because it looked like, man, during those situations where there was minor implosion or then, Chris, major implosion, the Fever just didn't seem to, excuse me, folks, they just didn't seem to really, things just didn't seem like that they were clicking and they weren't really working like they were, Chris. And I don't know if there was a lack of communication perhaps on certain plays, Chris, but it just looked like when the Fever coughed up those leads, man, there was some minor problems, and I think that kind of goes to a bit towards team chemistry, but also a bit perhaps on maybe that minor playoff inexperience thing, perhaps, Chris. Chris, do you think, though, that perhaps team chemistry may have possibly lacked a little bit in Indiana this year, Chris? How, again, there were a few games this year where they had those leads that they couldn't hang on to, Chris. Is that more so a problem on the court, or is that a bit of a problem with team chemistry, perhaps a little bit in a small fashion? Or, Chris, what do you think it might be, though, about them blowing those leads, though, incrementally?
I think probably just a little bit, no chemistry, probably.
Yeah, Chris, I think that the Fever sort of were like LA, where they kind of didn't know how to close games out, I think is what I should have said here. Not chemistry, Chris, but it just seemed like that the Fever didn't quite know how to close out those games when they were up by 8, up by 10, or up 4 late in the contest, and they needed one rebound or something to get back in the ball game. So I do think, man, that there were a few problems, Chris. And then, of course, man, the playoff run, Chris, started off hot with that quick sweep of the Mystics, Chris, but again, got basically blindsided by the Chicago Sky in 3 games, Chris, where, again, the Fever held the lead in game 2, man. But, again, Tamara Young tips in the putback to tie the game right as the buzzer sounds to avoid a sweep, Chris. And then in game 3, Chris, at home, up by a lot early, Chris, but couldn't sustain the lead, man. So, Chris, I think in that point, though, in game 3, when they had the lead and just lost it, I think that the Fever ran out of gas. I think that they really just weren't built to go too far after round 2. Perhaps they would have played either Chicago or Atlanta, Chris. What do you think, though, man, as you kind of think back to game 2 against Chicago, where they had the lead, Chris, and then a tap-in shot at the buzzer basically ties the game. They lose in overtime, and they get beat up at home in game 3. What do you sort of think was their problem, though, in those games? Was it, perhaps just not knowing how to close those games out towards the end? Or what do you think their problem was, though, going forward, though, in those 2 games that they blew for a chance to go into the WNBA Finals this season?
I think probably the chemistry and everything just didn't have it.
Chris, I think it also kind of can be contributed, Chris, to their hot and cold phases, Chris. How, as we recall, when they played the Sparks both times, they were scorching hot, Chris, to start off the game, but they went ice cold towards the end of the game, Chris. That's what I think, man, sort of their story of a season, man, was they get those big leads. They would start off so hot in quarters 1 and 2, man, but couldn't hold that lead for the second half of the contest, man. So I think that was their minor problem, I think, man, going forward. Now, Chris, as we get ready to reiterate a few things here, man, again, folks, if there are any Fever fans out there that are awake at about 1:45 in the morning over there in Indianapolis, give us your take on your team by tweeting into at LA Sparks 365, at Calamac3, right, LA Sparks fan 30, and let your voice and opinion be heard on the network. All right, Chris, to go back and reiterate a few topics here, man, with the Fever. Again, Chris, the Fever this season, Chris, finishing 16-18 and in second place in the WNBA Eastern Conference, finishing 3 games behind the Atlanta Dream for the number 1 seed in the 2014 standings. The Fever swept Washington in round 1 and then got upended by the Chicago Sky in the second round in a hard-fought 3-game series. Now, Chris, as we look ahead towards next summer, Chris, and towards 2015, Chris, before we do reiterate our topics here, Chris, again, okay, man, next season will be a year of transition, Chris. This will be Stephanie White's first full season as head coach after sort of taking over in a small fashion for Lynn Dunn towards the end of the year, Chris. Again, a transition year, Chris. They still, though, have Tamika Catchings, their star player in the lineup, Chris. And Chris, I think, though, man, that everyone around Catch is a good core of talent, Chris, between having Lenina Cott, between having Brianne January, Karima Christmas, Chris, and, of course, some players off the bench like Lashia Clarendon, Marissa Coleman around the forefront, and everyone else, Chris. I think that the Fever, Chris, still are going to be in the playoff hunt, Chris. They've been in the postseason for the past 10 seasons. They've been there for many, many years. They're going to be, a cream of the crop team for a while if they're in the Eastern Conference, Chris. What is your early thoughts as we look ahead for the Fever, Chris, towards 2015? Is it more so about player depth, the team chemistry, Chris, or is it about the turnover in the head coaching position, Chris? What is your talking point for next season, Chris, and why?
I think with a new coach, just not seeing Lynn Dunn, and it's going to be probably be a little bit different and no chemistry in the beginning of the season.
Chris, I think it'll take the Fever. It might take the Fever a bit to get used to Stephanie White again, Chris. They're not going to have Lynn Dunn on the sidelines, Chris. I more so, Chris, look at this as in regards to probably, Chris, more so about the team, Chris. I think that with Catch in place, that they can surround her with some players, Chris. And I think, though, man, that between Brianne January and Karima Christmas, Chris, if they do have that solid core talent that is geared to go far again, depending on how far they can go in the postseason next year. All right, Chris, to reiterate our talking points here for the Fever, and folks, by the way, tomorrow night, a quick heads up here, I'm going to be going over to see my grandfather tomorrow night with my brother and sister-in-law tomorrow night, so we will probably, folks, be pushing back our show time for our recap tomorrow night, folks. By the way, tomorrow night we'll be recapping the 2014 season for the Washington Mystics. And, folks, by the way, we might be joined tomorrow night, and Chris, I'll let you know, too, man, that we might actually be joined instead of Chris. We might actually be having Albert Lee from SwishAppeal.com as our guest tomorrow night here on the show to get his take, because he is a Washington Mystics beat writer. We could have him or another Mystics writer on the program in place of Chris tomorrow night, so doing a bit of an in-game sub tomorrow night on the program. But, Chris, again, as we go back towards the Fever, Chris, again, we know about Lynn Dunn, again, the turnover, Chris. I want to go back and talk about Tamika Catchings, Chris, one more time, Chris, because she has been, one of my favorite players, Chris, for a while after she got drafted by the Fever many years ago, Chris, and she's one of my favorites still. And, Chris, again, she did announce today, courtesy of SwishAppeal.com, Chris, that she is probably going to be retiring after the 2016 season does end. Chris, again, I really can't think of a better player that has represented her team and her city, Chris, with such class like she has, man. Again, a player that gives back to her community, Chris, so often and so much. It's unreal how much love that Catch has for Indianapolis, Chris. And again, man, this is a player that does battle being hearing impaired on the floor, Chris, and she still plays her off every night, Chris. And to not see her in red, white, and blue in 2 years, man, is just not going to be right in my view. Sort of like not seeing Becky Hammond next season, Chris. And again, man, it took her a while to get the ring on her finger, Chris. But again, man, as we do get ready, or as we do look back at Catch's career, Chris. Again, man, how are you going to remember Tamika Catchings, Chris? Is it going to be on the floor for all of the for her great play, battling a hearing impairment, Chris, or is it about her off the court, tremendous work off the court, Chris, that does not stop for anybody, whether they're male or female, Chris? I think it's both of them, Chris. I'm more so lean towards off the court, Chris. What about you?
I think probably both off and on the court.
Reasons why?
Just great basketball player on the court, and just kept giving off the court and just never stopped.
Yeah, Chris, I think that Catch we remember by everybody, Chris, not just for her career, Chris, but again, man, you've got to look, Chris, at what these players do off the court in their spare time, Chris. And Tamika Catchings, Chris, has been one player, man, that is a great role model for young girls growing up in the Indianapolis area because, she's got, she has so much class, so much dignity, Chris, and so much respect for people of her, for people of her ilk and not of her ilk, Chris. And, man, hey, man, if I can get Wiggins on, Chris, I'll say it here, Chris, Catch is the next player I asked to interview, Chris, because she has meant that much to the WNBA, Chris, and also she's meant that much to the city of Indianapolis, Chris. So again, man, hey, she might be the next player I do interview for an interview. Chris, going back to the playoff run, Chris, again, man, another great season for the Fever in the postseason, man. Sweep of Washington, Chris, but again, man, that blindsiding loss in 3 games to the Chicago Sky, Chris, that I think, or actually that we do know that no one did see coming, man. But I'll tell you what, Chris, I mean, they've been at the forefront of the playoffs, Chris, for the past few years in a row, man. What do you think, as the Fever sort of think about what happened this past season, Chris, what do you think, man, is their game plan to get over the hump next year and get to the finals next year after getting blindsided in the conference finals this season, Chris? What do you think it has to take for the Fever to get over that hump and into the WNBA finals next season in 2015?
I think have a lot of chemistry and probably get to it, the WNBA finals.
Yeah, Chris, I think a few things have to be tweaked a little bit, not a lot, but I think, though, man, that they will be back in the postseason sometime. They'll be back there again, top 4 next season. Again, folks, if you are an Indiana Fever fan that is up somehow, some way at 1:50 in the morning over there in Indianapolis and want to get involved here, send us a tweet at LASparks365, at CalamaC3, at LASparksFan30, and let your voice and opinions be heard. Again, folks, tomorrow night we'll be recapping the 2014 season for the Washington Mystics, folks. And again, we could be joined tomorrow night in place of Chris. Could be joined tomorrow night by Albert Lee, Mystics beat writer on switchfield.com, or another Mystics writer, folks, according to what Albert Lee told me via FaceTime audio a few nights ago, folks. He is possibly going to be on our show tomorrow night here. And again, folks, with me going over to see my grandfather going to see my grandfather tomorrow, folks. Again, we are weighing options right now. Again, we could have a 10 o'clock, 10:30, or folks, even a 11 o'clock showtime tomorrow night because of me being out of studio tomorrow night for a few reasons. Chris, as we do get ready here, man, to call it a night, man, your last thoughts about the Indiana Fever season and your early thoughts about the Washington Mystics season as we get there tomorrow night back here on the network. Chris, your last thoughts about Indiana and your preview thoughts about the Washington Mystics season.
Great season for the Indiana Fever. Making it to the playoffs in Lynn Dunn's final season in WNBA. Just didn't have it. Got eliminated, but great season by the Fever. And just a up and down roller coaster season by the Washington Mystics.
So again, folks, the Washington Mystics are tomorrow night, folks. And again, I will be joined perhaps, folks, by Albert Lee or another one of his outstanding Mystics writers from switchfield.com tomorrow night back here on the LA Sparks 365 network, folks. But with that, we will see you folks back here tomorrow night, folks. So again, with that, have a safe night. Drive home safely. Thank you all for coming, and good night. Now, this has been the LA Sparks 365 network. We are Sparks. We are LA, and we certainly are the WNBA. See you folks back here tomorrow night, recapping the 2014 season for the Washington Mystics. For Chris Mancy in Anaheim, California, Cal McClure from Studio 171 in San Diego signing off. We will see you folks tomorrow night. Bye-bye.